Welcome and thanks for joining me on TAP, otherwise known as the Alphabet Podcast. I'm your host, Liana Devine, and I'm a therapist based in Brixton, South London. I became a therapist because I was passionate about improving people's mental health. I decided to set up a podcast because I thought it would be a really cool, engaging way to get loads of people to interact with these difficult conversations around mental health, some of the stigmas, some of the barriers, and just getting them to engage with their mental health on a different level, maybe even becoming their own therapist in the process. So with that said, the alphabet concept was just a simple way of me putting together an A to Z of issues that I observe, both in my therapy and just in my friends and family, and sometimes in my own life, just the things that people are really struggling with. The aim is just to get people talking and to give people an idea of where they need to make the changes in their life in order to make them happier and to be more of your authentic self. So with that said, we'll just kick off. I think you guys will pick it up as you go along. So the alphabet concept. So this week, the letter is A. And the two topics that I've picked to discuss and bring into focus a little bit more are attachment and anxiety. Now, I think it will be easier for you guys to understand why I would be doing a segment on anxiety. It's something that a lot of people are struggling with, especially since COVID. More and more people have found that anxiety is affecting their day-to-day life and just affecting their mental health in a negative way. Maybe attachment, you guys might not necessarily understand why I'm doing it. The thing about attachment, so I probably should say why I'm doing attachment and why it's important. So attachment is all about the quality of your relationships. It goes back to your early caregiving experience, but it's all about the quality of your relationships. The important thing to note about attachment is that we all have attachment styles, all of us. We all have relationships, so it's something that should be of interest to all of us. So even if you have what is termed a secure attachment, which about half of us do, this podcast still could be of interest to you because it's likely that maybe some of the significant people in your lives, maybe friends, partners, family members, maybe they have certain attachment struggles, and it might be useful for you to see how you could maybe help them to navigate this. And for those of you that have attachment issues, which is, like I said, half of us, because only half of us have secure attachment, which means half of us are insecure. There's hope, and we don't have to stay where we are. If we're aware, we can move towards something more positive. So this look on attachment is not to make anybody feel bad about their past or what they're going through or some of the choices that they've made. It's all about just trying to gain awareness and make those improvements. So, like I've said, we all have an attachment style. And attachment theory simply says if your caregivers are physically and emotionally responsive to your needs, you will most likely develop a secure attachment. And that's important because secure attachment gives you the kind of template to have that basic trust, that basic self-esteem, and that positive worldview that becomes so important later on. That positive worldview is something that is essential. If your caregiver relationship lacks either a strong physical bond or a strong emotional bond, it's likely that you would probably have found things like trusting harder and possibly have lower self-esteem and definitely a more negative worldview. So with that being said, I hope you guys are still with me. We're going to try and have a look at attachment styles in a little bit more focus, give you an idea of what your attachment style is. Now, there's loads of ways that we could go about this. I could speak to you for the next 20 minutes all about these different attachment styles, but I do think it could come across as a bit heavy. For those of you that know about attachment, great. You're probably thinking, no, say more. For those of you that know less about attachment, the most important thing when we're trying to learn something new is to get a basic grasp so we can add more detail later. But for now, we just want to understand what our attachment style is and how it could be playing out in the present day in our relationships. So that's all our relationships, friendships, intimate relationships, maybe even relationships with colleagues at work, relationships with your children, all of that. So we're talking about it all. So the easiest way I've come to doing it is the story of the Johnsons. So, guys, let's meet the Johnsons. So we have Mr. and Mrs. Johnson and their 4 children, Orville, Jade, Jeremiah, and April. Now, the Johnsons as parents are loving parents. They take time with all their kids. They speak love to them. They have a strong physical bond with loads of eye contact and hugs. They're very emotionally responsive to the needs of all of their individual children. And as a result, the children are happy. Now, one day, Mr. Johnson leaves. Okay, this is something that happens in families every day. Mr. Johnson leaves. So now Mrs. Johnson is left with a near impossible task. She now has 4 children to raise by herself and to navigate work and all of the other things that come with being a parent. For the most part, Orville, who's 5 years old, his attachment style is already set up. His worldview is positive. He's had that experience of both his parents speaking love into him. He's developed what we call a secure attachment. So he's a very popular child, popular at school, very caring and supportive friend. And later on, he will take that into adulthood. He has good trust, good self-esteem. And like I said before, that positive worldview, that is very important. That is very important. So he has that positive worldview and he takes that into his adulthood. Now, young Jade, who's one of twins, she has a brother, Jeremiah. They are both 2 years old. Now, Jade, she really struggles with the change in circumstances. She spends most of her days at home with mom, who's working from home. Jade is not getting the same attention that she's previously been used to, having both parents and having those needs met. She still has her physical needs met. She's changed and fed, but mom has less time. Mom is more distracted, having to navigate work, deal with phone calls, emails, and that develops uncertainty in Jade. Jade now feels insecure about this attachment, feeling sometimes abandoned and rejected. So as a response, she will often raise her emotional state to get mom's attention. And this still doesn't work sometimes. And when it does, Jade decides to react with mixed feelings. In therapist terminology and psychology terminology, we call that ambivalence. So when someone reacts with mixed feelings, they don't show their true feelings, we call it ambivalence. So Jade has developed an anxious, ambivalent attachment. So she feels uncertain about herself, wonders whether she's truly loved and valued. And she takes that with her into adulthood. Now, young Jeremiah, that's Jade's twin brother. He's also 2 years old. Now, to help mum with childcare, Jeremiah spends a lot of his days with his uncle. Now, his uncle is like a lot of old school gentlemen. He's very loving and fond of Jeremiah. He loves him dearly, but he also has he comes from a different time and he has a different perception of the world. He believes that children should be seen and not heard. So whenever Jeremiah gets too loud or cries, that's immediately shut down. And there's sometimes a fear of punishment. So Jeremiah very quickly learns that showing your true feelings is punishable. There is punishment involved. So it's not a good thing. Okay, so he learns to avoid showing his true feelings through fear of criticism or judgment or that fear of being punished, and shuts down those emotional feelings and learns to self-soothe. So he deals with his emotional distress in his own way, but doesn't show it. And he takes that into adulthood. Now, young April, who's only 6 months old, doesn't really remember dad much. So all of those loving interactions are no longer a memory for April. She spends her days at nursery to make life easier for mom. And at this nursery, the staff are quite overworked, understaffed. There's a lot of children. April cries sometimes when she's sold her nappy and the staff don't come. She cries when she's hungry and the staff don't come. And April very quickly learns that nobody's going to come. So that kind of develops a sense of feeling unworthy of love in April. Now, when April's at home, mum, through the constant stress and pressure of trying to raise 4 children by herself, has developed quite a lot of depression and anxiety. This has meant that she hasn't really bonded with April. April often finds mum quite scary and frightening, and mum's behaviour scares April. So compounded with her experience at nursery, April has now learned very quickly that I'm unworthy of love and has conflicting feelings about trust, love and safety. So the safe haven is also a source of distress. And that's very confusing for April, who has developed what is called an fearful avoidant attachment is what it is called. And that's technically what you should call it. But it's also been called disorganized. And I like that term because I think the other two insecure attachments, so Jade with her anxious, ambivalent, And young Jeremiah, who has an anxious avoidant attachment style, just in case I didn't make that clear, he has developed an anxious avoidant attachment style. They go into more a structured format, so they react in a similar way. But with disorganized children and adults, they react in quite conflicting, contradictory way. And that's because they feel totally unworthy of love. They lack trust and they have a negative worldview. So that positive worldview that is there in the secure child is not there for the other three children. So they don't have that positive worldview that is so helpful later. So I hope the story of the Johnsons has helped that. Excuse me, guys. So what I'm going to do now is just to make sure that you guys are picking up your attachment styles. I'm going to go in depth a little bit more about each of them. So the secure attachment that we spoke about, that Orville has had his parents speak love into him, and he's developed that basic sense of trust and self-esteem and that positive worldview, serves him well in the future. So it's not to say that secure people don't have problems, because they do. But that positive worldview that they have developed from a very early age is helpful in dealing with the disappointments of life. They tend to take things on the chin. So, if relationships break up, they tend to be able to deal with that. If they lose people, they tend to be able to grieve and then go back. So that secure attachment makes them the kind of good guys. So, the good friends, the good partners, the good work colleagues, the popular people that are always cheering you up, that are emotionally responsive to you, kind, and they don't play games with you. Those are the secure type of people, and that attachment comes usually from your caregiving experience. Now, if you are anxious ambivalent, how does that look in real life? So you're going to have a lot of trust issues. You're going to have issues with your self-esteem. So you're going to wonder whether you're too much or not enough when it comes to being in a relationship. So remember, you've already got trust issues by yourself. You've got self-esteem issues by yourself, and you're now in a relationship. Those issues are going to get worse. They're not going to get better. So that may look like a lot of jealousy and possessiveness. So that might be the long text messages. So, them long text messages that you send to your partner, those ultimatums. If you go out, we're going to break up. It might involve making your partner jealous. So you playing silly games to try to get a reaction, not being comfortable speaking about your feelings. So obviously it would be so much easier if you could just say, I'm scared of you leaving and I'm scared of being rejected. It's very hard for anxious, ambivalent people to do that. So it causes them a lot of problems. It causes greater problems because they tend to also be attracted to anxiously avoidant partners, which we'll get into maybe a bit later, or if not in future podcasts where we go a bit more in depth. So now if we quickly move on to the anxiously avoidant attachment. So that's young Jeremiah. He's been raised with his strict, quite critical uncle and has learned that feelings are not good to show. Jeremiah takes that into adulthood, and his relationship style is to keep people at a distance. So anxiously avoidant people, they tend to keep you at a distance. So that might look like the ghosters in the relationships. So you might think everything's going well, perfectly happy, and then you just don't hear from that person again. Also, commitment phobes. So you might have been in a relationship with someone for a long time and you've been pressing to get married or move your relationship on further, and they're just not on it. They're not on it. That's usually how anxiously avoidants come out as well. So commitment issues. They may not even get into relationships. So they may be for want of a better word, the fuck boys. They may just have, and it can be fuck girls as well. Fuck in between. So everyone's included. Fuck people, I think we should call them. It's the short-term things, because you can get some of your needs met without having to get close to people, which is what they're scared of. They don't want to show emotions and they don't want to deal with yours. So you anxiously ambivalent ones that are drawn to these type of people, that is a nightmare waiting to happen. So these people will keep you at a distance. As children, these are the ones that kind of self-soothe. They're the little adults, the children that can play with other children, but they're quite happy to play by themselves. And it's the same as an adult. They're quite happy to be around people, but they tend not to get close to too many people. They will keep you at a distance by any means necessary. So now we move on to the fearful avoidant or disorganized children. So as well as developing that through things like neglect and trauma, you can also get it from having relatively inexperienced parents. So that's young parenting. If there's domestic violence in your parents' relationship, it's likely that you could have picked up that style. Parents with addiction problems, sorry, I mustn't forget that. But guys, it's so easy to develop this kind of attachment style just simply due to untreated mental illness. So remember I said it's not only just about being frightened, so all the trauma and that, it's about the frightened caregiver. So the parent that's fearful, because anxiety and things like that can be, so the fearful one or the depressed one that's not emotionally engaged, all of those things can lead to you developing this fearful avoidant or this disorganized attachment style. If you still have this attachment style into adult, it's likely that you're going to have a multitude of issues in your relationships. So you may be constantly being abused. You may be the abuser because of that's what you're seeing. But bear in mind, these people feel unworthy of love. So they may want to be close to you. They may love you and want to be close to you, but they don't know how. So that's very difficult to deal with. But for the most part, as children, we move away from being disorganized and more into one of the other two insecure attachments. So we'll either be anxious, ambivalent, where we show those mixed feelings, or we'll be avoidant. And you could understand, I'll say you, because I developed at one stage quite a disorganized attachment, but now I've moved to a more different type of insecure attachment, if that makes sense. I'm working my way through the levels like Mario. I'm trying to get to them top tiers. So you start off disorganized and then you move into one of the other two. And then that's where you can then try to navigate moving towards a more secure one. So I hope that helps. But now we've helped you guys to maybe know what your attachment styles are. What can you do? So if you're one of the people that's securely attached, you're so useful to this process. Your attachment to these people will help so much. Like I have a securely attached best friend and I use her to navigate so many different things. And when I'm unsure of how I should be feeling or the stage I should be at, I can use her as a mirror to look into. And she's also very emotionally responsive. So that's healing for me. And if you're insecurely attached, having someone that's secure around you, you will find quite healing. But there are things that you can do for yourself, first and foremost. So I would suggest, and this is something that often gets overlooked when people have a succession of failed relationships, they normally take the time out and they heal from whatever pain or trauma that they've been through in that relationship. But what they forget to do is work on themselves. So one of the best things you can do for yourself, if you have this insecure attachment where you may have these trust problems and these self-esteem problems, didn't get it from your caregivers, is to work on you. So that's improving your self-esteem. That's working on implementing boundaries in your relationship so that people get an idea of how to treat you. You teach them how to treat you. Also, it'll be important that you don't rush in. You take things slowly. So if you go back to having those secure friends, you're not necessarily sending your friend, these long text messages or going around trying to put pins in your friends' tires. And that's because simply you have this secure relationship based around trust and you don't feel the need to act out in that way. So it's important that you get that with the people that you're in a relationship with. Don't rush in. Take things slowly. Build trust. That is so, so, so important. Another good thing that you can do is work on your communication. So you have to work on being vulnerable. I know it's very hard to be vulnerable for a number of different reasons, but the reward for being vulnerable is so high. If you can just communicate what those fears are. I'm scared sometimes when you leave that you're not going to come back, or I'm scared that I may not be good enough for you. Give your partner the chance to provide that emotional responsiveness, that healing that you didn't get. Give them a chance. Another important thing, and I'm laughing as I say this, do not see red flags as a challenge. Please do not see red flags as a challenge. It might be quite exciting for you as an anxiously, ambivalently attached person, that avoidant person, they're ignoring you. That might get you going. But essentially, that's going to be the thing that destroys you in the end. So do not see red flags as a challenge. What other things can I think of? Be more aware, just by being more aware of your own negative patterns in relationships, because there is this thing called the repetition compulsion, which simply means the way how unresolved trauma from your past kind of repeats itself in your future relationships. So if you have that template where you're used to being around avoidant people when you're anxiously ambivalent, you may well, without realizing, seek out partners that are cold and avoidant just because your parent was cold or avoidant and that's what you're used to. That trauma makes you happy. It may be that you had a narcissistic parent, which you may not have been aware of as a child, but you may have had narcissistic parenting, or, your parent was mentally ill and you were constantly trying to fix things. So you do that with your partners. So it's being aware of your own negative patterns and seeing the repetition compulsions in your relationships. Now, just quickly on the flip side, before we move on to anxiety, because I'm aware that the time is ticking away, what can you do for other people in your life that are insecurely attached? So if you're securely attached, or even if you're insecure, but you've managed to navigate your way out of it, what can you do for others to help them to get to that point? Now, the first thing I would say is stay calm. And that can be extremely difficult when a person's reacting. You may just want to react back and just be like, who are you talking to? Like, why are you acting like that? But that will not be particularly helpful, okay? You have to try and remember that they're reacting, for the most part, to their past. It's not you that they're reacting to. It's the stuff from their past, and they may not even be aware. So provide reassurances where you can. So I'm not saying go around constantly reassuring your friend or constantly reassuring your partner. But if you care for that person and you want that relationship to work, the path to healing is going to involve some reassurance. Obviously, you can tell that off as your relationship grows and set boundaries, and by then they should feel more secure. But essentially, you have to provide reassurance where possible. Don't play games. If someone's insecurely attached and you really care for them and they're playing games, they could be doing the most. The most important thing is you don't react to that. You don't play games with them, okay? Take yourself out the game. Encourage them to communicate, but pick your moments. Don't just be like in the middle of a crisis, be like, babe, you should communicate. Maybe when they're happy and calm and you're close and you can start that conversation that can get them to open up. For avoidant people especially, but also for anxiously ambivalent, learning their love language could also be a good way to improve your relationship with them. I would say especially for avoidant people who obviously don't depend on others. They're so used to depending on themselves. They don't need you for anything. So essentially how you get these people to drop that guard and learn to become more dependent on you and show that, that little vulnerability is by learning their love language. So if it's physical touch, give them the little love taps or the hugs that they need. If it's acts of service, do something for them, but don't just do it once. Do something that takes the burden off them and do it consistently, because over time, what will happen is they will learn to depend on you. So I hope that's been helpful. I'm just going to have a little sip of my Vimto, and then I will be back on the other side with the segment on anxiety. So I'll see you guys in a bit. For me, anxiety is such a big topic and such an important topic because I genuinely believe it's something that we have all suffered from at some point in our lives. I think it is the fact that it can manifest in so many different ways and it looks so different on everybody, why sometimes people don't necessarily pick up anxiety in themselves. So let's start with the more specific types of anxiety. So I think we've all kind of felt anxiety when it comes to things like job interviews. Some people are fine with job interviews. Some people get really anxious. So they get the sweaty palms, the heart rate, maybe feeling faint, just, the racing thoughts, stuff like that. And for the most part, you don't really think that is a sign of anything more negative. And it usually isn't. We tend to all have certain situations that could bring an anxious response. And public speaking is another big one. Now, I'm someone that when you know me personally, I literally sit there and talk your ears off. But if it comes down to public speaking, I am a hot mess. I'm a hot mess. I can't sleep. I can't think. I can't do anything with my brain. So there's specific situations. For some people, it may be things like social situations. So hopefully just hearing me talk about this might be reminding you of people. So some people have anxiety in social situations. So social anxiety, they're fine by themselves. Maybe they're fine at work, fine in different situations with family, but just those social situations where you have to step out of your comfort zone, maybe meet some new people, that may be difficult for them. That looks differently. So I'll give you an example. You may have a friend who never comes to anything that you invite them to, but yet they're always happy for you to come around or come to yours. And for the most part, you could probably get the idea that maybe certain situations make them anxious and it's not an issue. Then you may have the friend that you're constantly inviting and they're constantly telling you that they're going to turn up and they always let you down. Now, at first look, it might just be that this friend is unreliable, but it could be that social situations are so daunting for them that even though they want to come and want to support and maybe even want to enjoy themselves, the feeling of just being in that situation is too unbearable. And then you maybe will have that other friend that you invite to situations, the life and soul of the party, that friend that always comes, but you notice that they have to maybe drink 1 or 2 drinks before they're comfortable in a situation. All 3 of those friends are different sides of the coin on how social anxiety affects us. So another type of anxiety that's quite common and that people don't usually connect to anxiety is phobias. I'm sure that most of you listening have some type of fear of something, and it could seem like the most irrelevant or irrational type of fear, but phobias are a common type of anxiety. Panic attacks is a type of anxious response. There's not always a known trigger for panic attacks, and not everybody that suffers from generalized anxiety disorder will suffer from panic attacks, but panic attacks is another form of how anxiety manifests in different people. So with that said, I did my research and I was looking at how best to put this out in a podcast to support people that may be suffering from anxiety every day. But I came across some stats that I found really interesting in the first instance. The first stat that really jumped out at me was that women are twice as likely than men to suffer from anxiety. Twice as likely. And then I had myself sitting here thinking, but why is that? And I think the easiest thing to go to when you're comparing men against women in any kind of arena is discrimination a factor? So I factored that in and I figured, okay, so, women are suffering from more discrimination that could make them more anxious. And then I looked at some social things that are quite obvious, like the role of women and the societal expectations of women. So all the many hats that women put on, mother, wife, sister, daughter, friend, all of those different expectations. And those expectations are usually that we do all of those roles to the same level. I'm a woman. I get that. I could see why we would maybe be more anxious than men just because of that. Women, not always. So guys that are raising their children, I salute you. And men do raise their children, but women do tend to be the primary caregivers. So think about the extra anxiety that puts onto a woman having to be the primary caregiver for 1, 2, or many children. Some things that are probably less connected to anxiety in women are things like social media and things like body image. So I know I'm someone that spends time on social media. I'm a therapist. I'm trying to see what's going on out in the world. And I spend some time on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. Yes, I've showed my age. Body image is a big thing for women. Women feel they need to look a certain way. And the images that come up on social media of these people living in their perfect lives, with their perfect homes, with their perfect partners and their perfect children, it affects people on a different level. I think for the most part, people understand on a logical level that these people are just capturing moments of their life and putting it out there to be seen in a positive view. And the reality might be different. But if that's all you consume and that's what you see, you could be tricked into thinking that somehow you're inadequate, and that could lead to anxiety. But another interesting stat that came up was that women are more likely to have suffered sexual abuse in childhood, and that can lead to greater anxiety. And I look at how people feel when they're anxious as to like a car that's constantly trying to start, you're constantly trying to spark it up, or that TV that's on standby. It's like a constant hypervigilance and, that feeling in your body. But moving on from women, which I find is interesting that they have more anxiety, but you can understand we're the nurturers. We do all of these things. We're looking at social media. We're feeling judged and we're more anxious. But the next thing that came to light pretty quickly was that Black women are more likely than white women to suffer from anxiety. And this aspect of the stats might not be so easy for people to understand. So white women, this is nothing against you, but I think it didn't take me much, because obviously I'm a female therapist, so, I represent women, but I'm also a Black woman. So I understand what Black women go through in comparison to white women. So the first thing that I have to say that while women in general do suffer from discrimination, there's an extra layer of discrimination involved in being a Black woman in society. So that can seem to partly explain why maybe Black women have higher rates of anxiety than white women. The white woman's struggle is not the Black woman's struggle. It really isn't. So you have the different socio-economic disparities, the inequality in wealth and living standards. Black women are more likely to be living in poverty than white women. On the whole, there are white women that live in poverty, and I'm not discounting that. But the struggle of the Black woman is definitely different. So you have that discrimination from being a woman, but you also have that extra layer of racism. And this layer of racism doesn't just exist in society. It exists in every aspect of society. So even therapy, healthcare, they're all microcosms of society. So if there is racism and discrimination in society, then there is same in the healthcare system. So there's something to be said about that. So just give me a moment. So looking at some other explanations as to possibly why, I found some interesting figures. I've seen the figures around Black men being more likely to develop psychosis. And I saw an interesting stat that Black people are 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. Now, on first instance, that probably looks like to maybe some white people that are listening, maybe some Black people that are listening, that just seems to suggest if Black people are 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act, then we must have more mental health. And that could be said to be true because of certain things like racism that affect our mental health differently to white people. But with stats, you have to look at them in a balanced way. And for me, Black people being 4 times more likely to be detained suggests that there could be more mental health. But more importantly, it suggests to me that Black people are not accessing the help. They're not accessing the help until it comes to a time of crisis. So then the figures would show that there are more Black people being detained under the Mental Health Act. That's because they're getting less help. Another one, I might have to get out of my seat for this one, and it's this whole idea of the strong Black woman. No, on second thoughts, I've decided to remain seated because I'm going to need my energy for this one. Now, this strong Black woman is something that you hear, and I think more and more people are becoming aware of the negative connotations of this term. It's something that Black women have accepted for years and years and years. And when you look at it on the surface, it seems to be a compliment. But what it actually means in reality is that every time a Black woman gets angry or shows her emotion, we become a stereotype. We actually become a stereotype. So I'm going to ask you at the beginning, is it that Black women are angry, or is it just that we are misunderstood, that our symptoms, they present in a different way? So, this strong Black woman who's not able to show emotion is unintentionally maybe being demonized. And if you're a strong Black woman that buys into this strong Black woman, it also affects how you deal with things. Like you may not necessarily reach out for that help or even feel like you can, just because there is this image that you're strong. And if you're strong, therefore you can't be vulnerable. So that has different implications and it has some serious impacts. Like we've already said, the disparities in healthcare, they're out there. Racism exists in healthcare, and it's a lot of the time due to unconscious bias, not understanding people's culture and how different presentations come into it. So, this strong Black women, we've got to challenge that when we hear it, because I know it didn't come from us. There was no Black woman ever that said, I'm going to call myself a strong Black woman. When it seems like a compliment, we're happy to wear it, but actually, it's actually a mill around our neck. Because when we do show our vulnerability, we are not seen. We are not seen and we are not heard. And the struggle of the Black woman is even different to that of the Black man, because the Black man's struggle gets highlighted a lot more than the Black woman's struggle. So we tend to get left to deal with all of our things and find a way to manage, which is all we've ever had to do. My friend sent me a reel on Instagram, very interesting reel, and it was just how in Black women, the presentations of things like depression and anxiety just look different. It looks so different. Think of the cussing, the nagging, the constant state of irritation that you may or may not have observed in some Black women or even yourself, because, the irritation, I can certainly relate to myself, that constantly being irritated, having a certain way of doing things and liking things done, worrying about your adult children. That is a sure sign of anxiety, worrying about your adult children. The insomnia, so you're not sleeping. Your mind's going, you're thinking about things. Black women, are you even getting any sleep? That's also anxiety. And I think when I look at myself and how these presentations of anxiety look in me and my mother and my sisters and my aunties, I see the cussing, I see the nagging, I see the not sleeping, I see the different way that we show things. And I also see it in my grandparents and the older Black people, Black women in the community, those maternal figures, that cussing, that nagging. but on the other hand, still feeding you and making sure that you're looked after in that way. But that's how anxiety presents, and it can be passed down. So I hope that kind of shows a different side to things. So getting back to a more general note, attachment and anxiety are closely linked. People's past and how they've grown up, how they've had relationships, how they navigate difficulties, it all affects whether you're anxious or not. So there's a certain part of anxiety that is learned behavior. So going back to what I said about the disorganized or fearfully avoidant child who had that experience of anxious parenting or a parent with mental illness, that can be absorbed into your personality. If your parent, your mum or your dad or someone close to you is anxious, you can learn that behavior. That's what they do. They show anxiety. So that's what you do. You worry because they worry. Things like phobias. When you hear that whole families are scared of spiders, is it that you're all scared of spiders? I doubt it. It may just be that you've all observed a parent reacting in a frightened way to a spider or a mouse or whatever it is that you're afraid of, and you've absorbed that fear or that phobia. Like my fear of heights, I can tell you it came from my mum. The fear of spiders that I thought I had until I realised that I don't, it came from my mum and her reaction when she was faced with a height or a spider. So it's important when you're around children that even if you're scared sometimes, not to show your fears, because they pick up and those phobias that you have will become their phobias. And it can actually make your children more generally anxious. When you think of anxiety disorder now, a lot of these adults would have had those experiences in their childhood. And we've done attachment today, so you can link it back there. Insecure people, which is 50% of us, insecure people worry more. And that's just because secure people have a more positive worldview. So it's not that their life is any easier, but this positive worldview that I emphasized in the first part of the podcast enables them to go with the roller coaster that life is, to react accordingly, not to worry more than they should, or worry about things that are outside of their control. They probably weren't overburdened as children, because that's another reason why anxiety develops in adults. If your parents overshared or overburdened you, or maybe criticized another parent, or just gave you cause to worry, it could be that you picked that up. So we've looked at anxiety, the different types of anxiety, the ones that we have specifically, job interviews, public speaking. We've looked at a little bit about phobias, how they're learned, but that's a type of anxiety. We haven't spoke much about panic attacks, because panic attacks look different for everyone. So for some people, it will be the racing heart rate, the sweating, some cold palms, feeling faint. Panic attacks look different for different people, which is why the first thing I ask a client who suffers from panic attacks is, what does that look like for you? But the thing that we look at as panic attacks, I'm going to incorporate into anxiety in general, because a lot of the things that you do to feel less anxious are the kind of things that you do to a different level when you're having a panic attack. So I'm going to spend the last few minutes of this podcast just going through the things that we can do for ourselves. And after that, if we try these things and they don't help, things that outside help that we can get to deal with our anxiety. So I'll start with the things that we can do for ourselves. So I learnt myself during COVID that when I watched the news every day, I felt quite anxious. It made me feel quite anxious. So that taught me a few things. And it really is, be careful what you consume. And when I say consume, there are a few things. So it's not just like the media and the social media and things like that. It's the people that you consume as well. So the people you have around you. If the people around you are quite negative and quite anxious, that tends to be the energy that you latch onto. So be careful what you consume, who you consume. It's good to manage our stress levels. As adults out there in the world, we've got so many stresses, so many things to worry about. We have to manage those stress levels. Different people find different ways. So for some, it will be exercise. For some, it will be sleep. For some, it may be knitting or crocheting. For some, it's going to the gym. Whatever it is for you, do it. But as a sports scientist also, as well as being a therapist, I'm also a qualified sports scientist. So I look at how health is holistic, mental health, physical health. Exercise is a very, 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 very wonderful thing for any kind of mental health that you're suffering from. And anxiety is no different. Exercise will help give you those happy hormones, the serotonins, the dopamine, the oxytocin, the things that you need to get your brain, those happy hormones flowing. So if you can manage your stress levels, another thing you can do to help manage your stress levels and for yourself is implement good boundaries. Simply just setting good boundaries means that, you'll have that good balance. You won't be burnt out. You'll have people treat you a certain way. So you're not going to have any extra stress. You'll know when to put things down when you're doing too much. Exercise is good for that, but exercise is also good for getting good quality sleep. How many of us are sleeping well? So some good sleep hygiene. And by sleep hygiene, I don't mean washing before bed, although that is recommended and could help. But it's like the whole routine that you go through before you go to bed. So sleeping starts way before you get into the bed. So do you switch off all the appliances? Are you in the dark? Are the things that you're doing the right things? Because there are things that you can look at within your sleep hygiene that can improve your stress and then your anxiety. Self-care, anything that makes you feel good, do it. Do a lot of it and do it as much as you can. Self-care looks different for different people. Like I say, some people will sleep. Some people will go to the gym. Some people will have a nice bath with candles. Whatever it is that you do, just do it well and do it often. A lot of the time, anxiety can be down to self-criticism. We didn't really look at that. But if you are aware that you're quite highly critical of yourself, so you feel like, your friends point out that you're always criticizing yourself, that can be a major driver for anxiety and perfectionism, which can also involve procrastination. Because if it's not perfect, how do I start? So all of that self-driven anxiety, what I find useful is some of it's unconscious and you're not always aware of it. And sometimes you feel like it's something telling you that you need to be doing more, you need to be doing that. But that's something, it seems like it's coming from inside you because it's internal, but it's actually all of the things that you've absorbed, all of the things that you think that you have to do to please people, or, the parent who thought you were never good enough. So you're always constantly trying to impress or be perfect in order to be validated. But if you can just catch yourself in moments like that, sometimes I'll have a day off and I'll find myself trying to do work and I'll be like, why can't I relax? Why can't I switch off? And that's because that internal voice that, that I think is coming from me is telling me I've got to do something. Lee, you've got to do something. You've got to get up. You don't. If you can catch that voice, and the best way to do it is when you feel like that, stop. Just stop for a moment and pause. But give that inner voice, give it a name, and give it not a powerful name, a weak name, a name that you associate with something weak or something negative that, that is not good, that you can just catch yourself. So I call my inner voice Karen. So for all you Karens out there, I do apologize. Most people know what we mean when we say Karen. So if I say to myself Karen when I'm feeling driven to do things, it stops me in my tracks. I laugh and I'm like, nah, we're not doing Karen today. We're going to take a seat and we're going to do what it was that we were supposed to do. So that's very helpful if the anxiety is being driven by you. This might seem like a cliche and it's probably the first thing that will come up when you put in anxiety or panic attacks, and it will be breathing exercises. And people just tend to just brush it aside. They think, oh, it doesn't really do anything. But what you'll find is the reason why it doesn't really do anything is because breathing exercises, just like any other type of exercise, you need to do it often for it to be effective. You wouldn't suddenly just turn up at the start line and try to run a marathon. You would train every day so that when it comes time to do that marathon, you're going to be able to run those 26 miles. And it's the same with breathing exercises. Do them daily if you can, if not as often as you can, because breathing exercises, they literally reduce your stress and your tension. Like literally, sometimes just taking some deep breaths and counting to 10 is the only reset that you need. And people just forget to do it. It's that simple that they forget to do it. A simple one that I use with my clients, just inhale to the count of 4, hold your breath for the count of 4, exhale to the count of 4, and repeat as many times as necessary. Do that for about 5 minutes a day. There are loads of other breathing exercises that you can find online, even meditation if you like that. So yeah, just remember it will be more effective if you use it and practice it on a regular basis. Journaling is particularly useful for anxiety. Some people find that they know what their triggers are and then they can try to avoid them to avoid panic attacks or anxious feelings. But for some people, panic attacks seem to come on for no reason. There tends to be a reason, but it's not a reason that you're aware of. Journaling is very good for that because you'll find that if you're writing just a few thoughts and feelings down every day, you might be able to see patterns, like the things that are going on in your life. You might be able to notice things that you feel in your body before you have a panic attack. These are all very important. The things that you notice are very important. So either in your body or in your mind, how you feel, how you're sleeping, how you're feeling, all of that. A good technique you can use when you're feeling particularly anxious or having panic attacks are grounding exercises. So you just ground your body. You can do the ones where there are some type of clenching and unclenching. You'll find loads of those online. But one simple one that I like to do is if I'm with a client, I would teach the client this, but sometimes even myself, I find myself when I'm overworked, feeling quite anxious. And to ground myself, I just look around wherever I am and just focus on 5 things that I can see. So that's 5 things that I can see, 4 things that I can touch. And if I'm feeling particularly anxious, I may get up and touch those things. So I'm actually walking around and touching these things, or the floor, the chair, whatever it may be. And then you want to move on to 3 things that you can hear. So as I'm recording this podcast, I'm aware that I can hear the traffic outside and I can hear the other person in the house moving around. So, things you can hear. 2 things that you can smell. So any 2 things that you can smell around you, and 1 thing you can taste. It might be like your chewing gum, the coffee that you had. Just focus on the taste and repeat if necessary. If the feelings are particularly intense, you may sit where you are and just talking exercises to bring yourself back. So I do things like, my name is Leanna Divine. I'm sitting on a chair. I'm in a room by myself. I have a mic and I'm talking to the podcast world. But just by repeating certain things, you're bringing yourself back into the present and regulating your breathing and all of the things that kind of get a bit erratic or dysregulated when you're having a panic attack or a particularly anxious experience. Timetables is another good one if you like maths, or thinking of some really random colours, not just blue or green. We're thinking of the turquoises of this world, things like that. If you've tried all of the things that you can do, like medication, which I always think should be a last resort and not a first resort, because it doesn't deal with the cause. Even though you may feel better, you may not know why you feel like that. And I think knowing why can help you get better long term. So if that fails, you can take medication or you can do talking therapy. Talking to a therapist is extremely helpful for anxiety because they will normally help you to find where the root cause of that anxiety is. Now, if you're someone that's tried loads of different therapy, it might be that you need to try something else. So there's different types of therapy. You have EMDR, which is particularly useful for anxiety and phobias and potentially panic attacks. So that's eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing. So this is just like some structured eye movements that are usually done together with specific type of talking therapy. And together they remove the negative association that you have with things. So it's not the same as hypnosis, but a lot of people see it as along those lines. But EMDR can be effective. It is quite expensive, but you tend to need fewer sessions. So it's something that if you've had particularly long history of dealing with anxiety and nothing's helped, EMDR may be something that you can look into. I know a very good EMDR therapist who is my mentor and supervisor, and I can happily recommend you to her. So if you hit me up on my social media, just another thing that you can do when you're feeling anxious if you're by yourself. I know some people may have heard of the emotional freedom technique where you do the tapping in specific areas and it brings you back. But if you're by yourself, something that can be particularly helpful is a type of bilateral tapping. So it's almost like a type of self-soothing. And you can do it just when you're feeling a bit upset yourself. So you're literally just putting your left hand on your right shoulder and your right hand on your left shoulder. So you're crossing your arms across your body and you are patting alternatively. So you're literally just giving yourself a pat on the shoulder, but one each side, and doing it in a rhythmic way. And so it almost resembles like a hug, the pat that you get with a hug, but you're doing it one side and then the other side in a rhythmic fashion. And that kind of soothes your nervous system and brings you back down. If you're having a panic attack and you're around somebody, how that person can help you is to reach out to you and just gently hold your hands while going through the breathing techniques with you. So an example of that is when you're in labour, you do all those classes, your prenatal classes, and you go through all the breathing and your partner does it with you. That's the same response. You're trying to bring your emotional state back down. So hopefully that will help. What else can I think of just before I wrap it up? Maybe putting your hands in cold water. So you can put your hands in some cold water and feel how, the cold water feels on the front of your hand, in between your fingers, on the back of your hand, and then increase the temperature of the water and think about how that feels. Anything that can distract you and bring you back down to a more regulated state. And it's important to note that a lot of people struggle with anxiety, and it's not something that will definitely disappear overnight, but there are some things that you can do for yourself, and there are outside things that you can do to support you on your journey to living a less anxious life. Because let's face it, guys, life is stressful. We are going to have a certain amount of anxiety, but it's like everything else. As long as there's a balance and it's not too overbearing, it will be fine. So thanks for listening today, guys. I hope the segments on attachment and just a little bit that we've done on anxiety and how the different presentations and what we can do has been helpful. Join me next time where we'll be talking about boundaries and how we implement those in our lives and in our relationships so that we can have better, stronger, more healthy relationships. And also we're going to have a look at being Black and British and what that does to people's mental health. So thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you next time.